Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The morning Adeyaha left the city, the sun hung low in the sky like a reluctant witness. Her hands gripped the steering wheel of her silver SUV, though her mind was far from the highway ahead. The engine hummed with life, but her spirit wandered through alleys of memory, places no map could chart. Portavira stood behind her like a cold ex-lover, fast, loud, and gleaming with false promises. She had fought hard to survive in that jungle of ambition, clawing her way to wealth while fending off the ghosts of a past she buried in silence. But when sickness came knocking and wrapped itself around her chest like a wet cloth, all that glamour proved useless. She had stared death in the face for 3 months, lying in her high-rise apartment with beeping machines counting her borrowed time. The doctors spoke in codes, her daughter Ezin whispered prayers, and Adeyaha, between dreams and delirium, made a silent vow. If life gave her one more dance, she would not waste it chasing shadows. She'd return to the one place her soul once felt light, the village of Yumyuk, where time walked barefoot and hearts beat in rhythm with the earth. That morning, with Ezin watching through misty eyes, she packed 2 suitcases in her silence, then turned the ignition. As the car rolled forward, Ezin ran beside it, slapping her hand on the window, saying, "You're chasing peace where there's no light, Mama." Adeyaha simply smiled, her eyes ahead, as if the road itself had whispered her name. "Sometimes," she murmured, "light is overrated." The tires kissed the highway, and with each mile, she shed a layer of her old self. Streetlights faded. Skyscrapers turned into distant dreams. The trees grew taller. The air thickened with the scent of rain and red soil. By the time she crossed into Yumyuk's edge, it felt like she had stepped out of the world and into a forgotten song. The village hadn't changed much, except that it had grown quieter, as though it, too, had aged in her absence. Tall trees arched above the narrow red paths like wise elders bending to whisper. Children ran barefoot, shouting greetings she could barely catch. And everywhere she looked, there was a stillness that didn't exist in the city, a kind of hush that wrapped around her like a shawl. Her car crunched over gravel as she approached the only compound her heart remembered. Innocent's home sat on the far side of the village, tucked behind 2 mango trees that stood like old sentries. The gate was slightly ajar, as if it had been expecting her. She stepped out of the car, the air thick with the scent of hibiscus and something older, memory. The door creaked open before she could knock, and there he stood, innocent, older than her memory had preserved, but still the same man beneath it all. His hair had turned silver, and his shoulders stooped like they carried stories he no longer told. For a moment, neither spoke. It was not awkward. It was sacred, like time itself bowed and stepped aside. "Adeyaha," he finally said, voice cracking like dry wood. "It's really you." She smiled softly. "I told you I'd come back when the noise got too loud." Innocent chuckled, though his eyes shimmered. "It got loud, didn't it?" She nodded. "Loud enough to hear my own heart again." He didn't ask why she had returned. Some questions lived better unspoken. Instead, he gestured for her to come in, and she followed, her suitcase wheels dragging softly behind like obedient shadows. Inside, the house smelled of kerosene, old wood, and memories. His late wife's portrait hung by the corner, her face serene. Adeyaha's eyes lingered on it only briefly. When he offered her a room, the one his wife once slept in, she hesitated. "Are you sure?" she asked. He nodded. "She wouldn't mind. You deserve a place that breathes." She didn't protest further, though the room's air hung heavy with something unspoken. That night, as she lay on the unfamiliar bed, listening to the crickets chant secrets to the moon, she wondered if the past had truly died, or if it was simply asleep, waiting for its name to be called. Innocent's compound had aged gracefully, like a man who wore his scars with dignity. The walls bore stains of time, rain shadows and sun-streaked patches, but they stood strong, unyielding, much like the man himself. Adeyaha spent her first few days rising early, watching the village stir awake with the cock's crow. Smoke spiraled from mud kitchens, women swept courtyards in rhythm, and old men gathered beneath trees to chew cola and speak in parables. There was a rhythm here, not just in motion but in spirit. Every step meant something, every silence had a story. Innocent would often sit with her under the mango tree, peeling oranges and tossing the skins into the sand. They talked about the weather, the failing schools, the price of Gary, but never about what truly mattered. Pain has its own language. It waits behind smiles, crouches inside pauses. One afternoon, while the sun drew gold patterns on the ground, Innocent's younger son Ken returned from the farm. He was tall, lean, and carried himself with the air of a man constantly ready to defend something. The moment his eyes landed on Adeyaha, he stiffened. His voice was respectful but cold. "I didn't know we had a visitor." Innocent, oblivious or pretending, replied, "This is Adeyaha, an old friend." Ken said nothing, but his eyes said plenty. That evening, Adeyaha caught him staring through the open doorway, his gaze fixed on the room she now occupied. Later, when he spoke to his father, his voice rose like thunderclouds. "You gave her mama's room?" Innocent's tone was firm. "It's just a room." But Ken wasn't convinced. That night, under the cover of shadows, he made a call. The conversation was short, clipped, and ended with a bitter laugh. "So this is how it begins," he muttered, tossing the phone aside. Whatever storm he had been holding in his chest was beginning to gather. Meanwhile, in Portavira, Ezen sat on the edge of her mother's empty bed, scrolling through old messages. Her heart felt like a door left ajar, part of her proud that Adeyaha had chosen peace, another part afraid that peace would come at a cost. Her mother had always been strong-willed, the kind of woman who'd drink rainwater if it meant escaping the noise of the world. But village life wasn't a place for the unguarded. Ezen knew it. The people were kind until they weren't, helpful until secrets began to stir. Adeyaha's voice in her last call still rang in her ears. "Don't worry about me. The sky here is big enough for two hearts." But Ezen had grown up learning that the biggest skies hid the darkest storms. Back in Yumyuk, Adeyaha began adjusting to life that didn't require high heels or constant calls. She visited the stream, joined women at the market, and sometimes sat under the almond tree simply to listen. The village embraced her in bits and pieces. Some smiled, some stared, some whispered. But she didn't mind. She had come to feel, not to be understood. One afternoon, as the breeze danced with fallen leaves, she picked up a dried petal and stared at it for a long time. "Even broken things get to be beautiful," she said softly. Just then, Innocent sat beside her, his shirt smelling of palm oil and history. They didn't speak for a while. Only when the shadows began to stretch did he say, "Ikem is coming for the New Yam Festival. You'll finally meet him again." Adeyaha smiled, but something inside her fluttered. The child she once bore in silence, the boy she had watched from afar, he was coming home. And with him, the truth she had kept hidden beneath layers of time and longing. Ken's unease brewed like a pot left on fire, low and slow but steady. From the moment Adeyaha stepped into his mother's room, something inside him had snapped quietly. He didn't show it the way people expected anger to be shown. Instead, he held it in his jaw, his shoulders, in the way he walked around the compound like it was unfamiliar. The evening after their argument, he left the house without eating, his sandals kicking up red dust as he vanished into the narrow path behind the cassava field. Innocent, meanwhile, returned to his chair under the mango tree, rubbing his temples like he could squeeze the past out of his skull. Adeyaha sat beside him, saying nothing. The air between them was not heavy, but full of what had been said and what had not. She had not intended to cause trouble. In fact, she had hoped that the years had softened everything. But the truth, like an old drum, never forgets its sound. That night, she stared at the ceiling and thought about her son. Not Ken. The other one, Ikem. The boy she had once cradled before vanishing from his world with nothing more than a whisper and a tear. She wondered what kind of man he had become. Was he anything like her? Did he walk fast or slow? Did he bite his nails when anxious like she once did? She had imagined this moment countless times over the years, but never with this much ache in her chest. The next morning, the village rooster sang earlier than usual, or maybe it only felt that way because sleep had betrayed her. She rose, bathed in cold water, and dressed in a simple wrapper. By the time Innocent found her, she was already outside sweeping the compound, her strokes measured, like she was trying to scrub away the ghosts. "You don't have to," he said softly. She smiled. "It keeps my hands from trembling." He understood. Ikem's arrival came on a Wednesday, unannounced but not unexpected. The whir of his motorcycle echoed down the road before his figure even appeared. He was taller than Adeyaha remembered, his back straight, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses that made him look more like a visitor than a son of the soil. As he stepped down, the villagers greeted him warmly, especially the older women who remembered him as the boy who used to chase goats around the square. He nodded politely, though his attention was clearly elsewhere. When he entered the compound, Innocent embraced him tightly. "My son," he said with emotion tucked beneath his voice. You came. Icum smiled and glanced around. I needed air. Then his eyes met Adeaha's. She stood by the guava tree, her hands resting on the bark as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. Their eyes locked, just a moment, but something passed between them. She looked away first. Good afternoon, she said. Welcome home. He nodded, still unsure what to make of her. That evening, the family sat around a small wooden table, eating yam porridge and fried fish. The conversation was casual. How the roads were now riddled with potholes, how the new chairman was making empty promises, but underneath it all, something thick swirled in the air. After dinner, Innocent suggested that Icum and Adeaha take a walk. It was his way of nudging the inevitable. They walked along the footpath that led to the stream, the sky above full of quiet stars. You're not from here, are you? Icum asked suddenly. She hesitated. No, not originally. He nodded as if confirming something he had long suspected. You remind me of someone I don't remember. Her breath caught for a second, but she said nothing. At the stream, she sat on a flat rock while he skipped a stone across the water. You know, he said slowly, I grew up thinking truth was just another version of silence. But sometimes silence is a lie in disguise. Adeaha looked at him then, tears threatening but withheld. You're wiser than I was at your age. He chuckled. That's what time does to people. It teaches or it hardens. They walked back in silence, the words between them echoing long after the night swallowed them whole. The New Yam festival came like a river after drought, colorful, noisy, and full of restless joy. The villagers adorned themselves in traditional wrappers, coral beads, and smiles that reached their ears. Drums spoke a language older than words, and feet moved in praise of harvest and life. For a moment, the air in Yumyuk carried no sorrow, no memory, just rhythm. Adeaha wore a wrapper with deep orange patterns, her headscarf tied modestly. She didn't come to be seen, but to witness. Innocent stood by her side, occasionally translating jokes she didn't catch, though her laughter often came half a second late. Ken was nowhere to be found. They asked after him, but no one gave a clear answer. He had always been unpredictable, the kind of man who moved like wind and never left footprints. Icum, dressed in a white native attire, mingled freely. He was charming, careful with his words, never too familiar, but not distant either. The elders praised his manners, the younger girls giggled when he passed, and the masquerade dancers hailed his return. But through all the celebration, Adeaha felt an emptiness behind his laughter, a space only truth could fill. After a few hours, she whispered to Innocent that she was tired. He offered to escort her home, but she waved him off. Stay. You haven't laughed like this in years. She walked back alone, the path lit only by fading sun and memory. As she neared the compound, she noticed the gate slightly open. Something about it felt off, like a whisper out of place. She stepped in, the compound unusually quiet. Her sandals tapped against the cement floor, but no voice welcomed her. A shadow moved behind her, but when she turned, nothing was there. She shook her head. Maybe it was the heat. Inside, the air was still too still. She walked to her room, intending to lie down. But before her fingers touched the doorknob, a cloth covered her face, and the world vanished. Hours passed. Or maybe days. Time had no meaning in the dark. When Adeaha woke, her wrists were tied, her mouth dry, her back aching from sitting too long on a bare concrete floor. Her eyes were covered, but her ears were wide open. She heard murmurs, footsteps, the occasional clang of metal, and once, the soft sob of someone she couldn't place. Her throat burned for water, her limbs screamed for freedom, but fear kept her still. She was not unfamiliar with danger. The city had shown her its cruel face many times. But this was betrayal dipped in silence. She listened. The voices were young. One of them had a slight stammer. Another chewed noisily. Then came the sound of a plate being placed beside her. Eat, a voice said, muffled through a mask. She said nothing. A few minutes later, a phone rang. A simple ringtone. Something clicked in her brain. It was a sound she had heard before, at the compound. Not in a dream. In real life. Her heart skipped. Her mouth, dry as it was, managed one word. Ken. Silence. The plate was dropped. Footsteps stumbled back. Then the door slammed shut. She was alone again. But not the same. Now she knew. Knew that the past had not stayed buried. It had grown roots in the children of the future. The village was too quiet the next morning, as if the trees and wind themselves had been warned to hold their breath. Innocent woke early. expecting to find Adeaha sitting on the porch with a cup of hot cocoa in her hand the way she always did since she arrived. But the chair was empty, and the mug remained untouched on the tray beside it. At first, he told himself she had simply gone for a walk. She liked doing that, walking through the paths behind the market, where the air still smelled of charcoal and herbs, and where the older women greeted her with soft nods of respect. But as the morning stretched and turned to noon, his unease grew roots. He called out her name once, twice, then again, each time a little louder, his voice shaking like a cracked bell. Ken was already gone, his slippers missing from the corner of the compound. Innocent tried Ike's line, and it rang once before going dead. The old man sat on a wooden stool under the mango tree, his hands trembling as he rubbed them over his knees. He wasn't a man who panicked easily, but there was a chill in the air that even the sun couldn't chase. He waited till dusk before speaking to a neighbor. Then, with hesitation, he walked to the home of the village chairman and asked if anyone had seen her. No one had. The feeling in his chest wasn't panic anymore, it was fear made solid. When Ike finally returned in the evening, his shirt drenched in sweat and his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, Innocent didn't speak immediately. He only looked at him. Long quiet. Searching. "She's not here," he finally said, the words falling out of his mouth like broken teeth. "I've looked everywhere." Ike stood there for a while, unmoving, like a man trying to remember whether he had left the door open or not. Then he turned slowly and walked into Adeaha's room. Everything was still in place. The wrapper she had worn to the festival lay folded on the bed. Her bag sat by the wardrobe. Her slippers were still at the foot of the door. It didn't look like she had packed. It didn't even look like she had left. And that, more than anything, frightened him. He checked her drawer. Her phone was gone. That was strange, she rarely took it anywhere. He walked out and called her number. It rang. Once. Then silence. He called again. This time a different voice answered, a voice low and distant. "If you go to the police again, you won't see her alive." Ike's lips parted, but no sound came. The call ended. Cold sweat broke out on his back like he'd been dipped in ice. He called again, and the number was switched off. The lines on his forehead deepened. He looked at his father, whose eyes were now two dull stones. "We need to call Ezen," Ike said. "Now." Innocent shook his head. "She'll panic." "She has to panic," Ike replied, "because I think this has gone too far." When Ezen arrived the next day, the fire in her eyes could have lit the whole village. She was not the kind of woman who waited for explanations, she demanded them. She listened in silence as Ike and Innocent spoke, her jaw tight, her arms crossed. When they mentioned that the police had been alerted, and that a call had warned against it, she didn't blink. "Then we'll find another way," she said. "But we are getting my mother back." The next evening, the call came again, this time clearer. 50 million naira. 3 days. No games. Then the line died. Ezen didn't flinch. "I'll get it," she said. "They don't know who they're messing with." Inside the shack where Adeaha was held, time crawled like a wounded animal. Her legs were stiff from being bound, her back sore from the hard floor, but her mind remained alert. She had stopped crying after the second day, not because there was no pain, but because her tears had dried up somewhere between prayer and paralysis. The food they gave her was tasteless, barely enough to keep her strength. The voices of her captors echoed through the walls like shadows with names. She tried to trace them, to match them to faces, to mannerisms, but they wore masks even in speech. One, however, stood out. His footsteps were heavier. His voice had hesitation, as though conscience gripped it like a vine. The others barked, joked, cursed, but this one often said nothing. That was the one she feared and pitied most. Then came the moment that changed everything. The boy had entered the room quietly, and placed the usual plate of beans and cold yam near her feet. As he moved back, his phone rang. Adeaha didn't move at first, until the ringtone struck something deep inside her memory. It was a local gospel song, one she had heard playing on Ken's phone several times at the compound, especially in the mornings when he watered the garden. Her lips parted. "Ken!" The name dropped like a rock into still water. The plate clattered. She could hear the sound of panic in the boy's breath. His footsteps scrambled backward. The door slammed. Silence. Long unbroken. But in that stillness, Adeaha felt something shift. She wasn't alone in her suffering. Someone she once saw as family had become a stranger behind a mask. That knowledge cut deeper than rope. Ken paced behind the wooden shack, his hands pressed tightly together as if prayer would come through pressure. His mask hung from one ear, forgotten. He cursed under his breath and kicked at a stone, sending it flying into the bush. The others hadn't heard her say his name. He was sure of that. If they had, the whole plan would have collapsed by now. Icum had warned him, made him swear to stay calm, to follow the plan. We take the money, we disappear. That's all, Icum had said. But now everything had changed. Ken hadn't expected her to know. Or maybe he had underestimated how deeply mothers remember. He looked at his phone again, the same ringtone still set, untouched. His thumb hovered over it. He could change it. But what was the use now? The damage was done. Back in the village, Icum spoke to a man in hushed tones behind the bar near the mechanic's shop. He handed over an envelope and received a small black device in return. Keep this quiet, the man warned. If this leaks, don't say you got it from me. Icum nodded. Mum's the word. The irony made him smile. By the next day, the ransom was ready. Ezen insisted on going with Icum to the drop point, but he told her no. Let me do this, he said. You've done enough. Ezen hesitated but agreed. As he left, she stood in the compound with her arms folded, a storm waiting for a sky. The money was dropped where instructed, inside a black sack near the old shrine at the edge of the forest. Icum walked away without looking back. He called Ken moments later. It's done. Ken answered with a dry chuckle. Your share is already here. They both laughed, but the laughter didn't reach their eyes. The air inside the safe house was beginning to thicken with nerves. What had started as a plan, clean in theory and greedy in intent, was now slipping through the cracks of human emotion. Ken stood by the rusted window, his fingers pulling nervously at the edge of the curtain, watching for movement that wasn't there. Adeaha was silent now, ever since the moment she'd called his name. He hadn't dared go back in, not after that. The others didn't suspect anything yet, or if they did, they hadn't voiced it. Ibuka, the eldest among them, remained the loudest and most careless. He paced around like he owned time, bragging about what he'd do with his share of the money. First thing I go buy na car, he boasted. Red. Convertible. The one-way go make girls' day fall anyhow. The youngest, Samto, barely said anything beyond yes or no. He looked scared half the time, and the other half lost. They all wore masks now, not just the physical ones, but those stitched with fear and doubt. Outside, night had fallen again, swallowing the trees and casting long fingers across the dirt path. It was the kind of darkness that didn't just hide things, it threatened to reveal them. Inside her room, Adeaha sat hunched, no longer struggling against the ropes that held her. The pain in her wrists had numbed, but the ache in her chest had grown heavier. She kept replaying that ringtone, that brief moment of recognition. The voice hadn't betrayed much, but she was a mother, and a mother does not forget a sound tied to her child's daily rhythm. She didn't know how deep this betrayal went, only that Ken was involved, and that changed everything. Not just the danger she was in, but the past she had carefully folded and tucked away. Elsewhere, Ezen paced through the compound like a lioness denied sleep. Every hour felt like a week, and every time a bird flew too low, she turned her head sharply, half expecting bad news wrapped in feathers. Her phone remained glued to her hand, her ears tuned to vibrations, waiting for a call, any call. Her mother's absence gnawed at her, chewing slowly through memory and faith. What scared her most wasn't the demand for money, it was the silence that followed. She had transferred the 50 million without blinking. Money could be made again. But her mother was flesh, blood, laughter, and history. No bank could restore her. Innocent sat quietly by the entrance, a bowl of untouched food beside him. His face was heavier than usual, not from age but from guilt that refused to sleep. He had brought Adeaha back into their lives and opened the door to wounds he thought were long healed. Icum, since dropping the ransom, had not said much either. He walked around like a man with weight on his back, not the physical kind, but something heavier. At night, he lay on his mat with his eyes wide open, watching the ceiling as if it might speak the truth he was too afraid to voice. The call that came the next morning was brief. A different voice this time. More direct. The money has been received. You'll hear from us soon. Then the line went dead. No thank you, no confirmation. Just more waiting. Ezen clenched her fists, her lips pursed in fury. They've taken the money. They should return her now, she said, her voice low but trembling. Innocent nodded slowly, but Icum said nothing. He only looked away. Back at the hideout, Ken finally worked up the courage to face the storm brewing in the other room. It wasn't bravery that led him there, it was desperation. A seed of panic had begun to root in his mind, and he needed to know how much had truly been exposed. He waited until the others were outside talking, then crept in quietly. Adeaha didn't move as he entered, but he knew she knew it was him. Her head was still bowed, the blindfold pushed slightly above one brow now, her eyes half open but watching. He didn't wear his mask. It felt pointless. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, she broke the silence. "Why?" she asked, her voice brittle as dry leaves. He exhaled slowly, trying to find an answer that didn't sound like cowardice. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," he muttered. "It was supposed to be clean." She blinked once, her gaze sharp. "Clean? You tied me up like a goat. You planned this?" He hesitated. "No, I didn't plan it. I just followed." Her lips trembled, but not with fear, with fury. "You followed," she echoed. "You followed someone into kidnapping a woman who sat at your table, who ate the food you planted in your father's compound." Ken shifted. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand," she snapped, her voice rising. He lowered his eyes. "It wasn't supposed to be you. Icum, he found out things. About you. That you were rich. That you were important. He said it was just to scare you, take the money. No harm." Adeha shook her head slowly, her mouth curling with disbelief. "Your brother planned this?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence between them did all the talking. That night, the final domino fell. Ken, tormented by the truth and weighed down by the guilt of hearing his mother speak his name through ropes and blindness, made the decision. He returned to the room under cover of dark. The others had begun drinking to celebrate, their laughter echoing carelessly. He found her sitting still, awake, alert. He carried a knife in his palm, not like a weapon, but like a key. When he cut the ropes, she didn't flinch. When he whispered, "Go," she didn't run at first. She looked at him for a full second, a look that held 1,000 questions. Then she stood. Her legs wobbled, but they moved. She stepped out quietly into the bush behind the compound. The night was thick, but her senses had sharpened. Freedom was a whisper she could barely believe. But it wasn't done yet. 10 minutes later, a motorbike screeched to a halt at the front of the compound. Icum stepped down, a torch in one hand, a pistol in the other. "Where is she?" he barked. Ken's heart nearly leapt from his chest. "She's gone," he said. "I let her go." Icum's voice dropped. "You what?" Ken stood taller, the fear gone from his face now. "She knew it was me. I couldn't let it go on." Icum's face darkened. "You've ruined everything." He turned, scanning the bush, then charged in. Somewhere in the darkness, Adeha was running, her breath shallow, her legs crying for rest. Then she heard it, footsteps fast and furious. She turned. Icum was coming. "You think you can leave?" he shouted. "After what you did?" She stopped, spun around, faced him. Her chest heaved. "I didn't come to suffer. I came to take my son home." His expression shifted. Just slightly. Then came the flash of torchlight in the distance. Voices. Orders. The rustle of uniformed men breaking into the night. The game was over, and Adeha's truth was about to step into the light. The weight of silence returned with more force than the chaos it replaced. After the police had surrounded the compound and Icum had been subdued, hands bound and mouth still spewing defiance, there was no celebration, only breathless pauses. The officers found Adeha sitting beneath a cashew tree just a few feet away, her feet muddy and trembling, but her eyes still fierce. She didn't cry when they reached her. She didn't ask questions or offer explanations. She simply stood, like a pillar left standing after a storm, and followed them back. The officers didn't need to drag Icum or Ken. Neither resisted. What was the point? The lie they built had crumbled. Their father stood at the station before either of them arrived, called by one of the officers who recognized his name. Innocent's face looked carved from grief. He didn't ask what had happened. The truth was in his bones now. When the boys were brought in, his body swayed slightly, as though the wind had taken out part of his soul. Icum didn't meet his eyes. Ken did. And it was Ken who first spoke. She knew. From the beginning. The officer beside him barked at him to stay quiet, but Innocent raised a hand. "Let him speak," he said, voice quieter than breath. "Let me hear what betrayal sounds like from my own blood." Ken's lips trembled. "I didn't plan it. I swear. I only helped carry it out. But it was Icum. He found out who she was, what she had. He thought she was just some rich woman. He didn't know what." Innocent interrupted. His voice cracked. "That she was your mother?" The words dropped like stones into the room, and Icum's head shot up at last. It was as though the ceiling had collapsed without warning, crashing down on years of silence that had once protected everyone involved. Icum looked directly at his father now, the rage that had once danced behind his eyes washed away by something else, confusion, or maybe fear. "What do you mean?" he asked. The room grew still. Even the humming from the desk fan seemed to halt. Innocent took a step forward, his hands trembling at his sides, his eyes wet with a sorrow too old to be sudden. "She didn't come here just to rest. She came here for you," he said slowly. "And now you've drawn blood from the very hand that brought you into this world." Icum swallowed, his face blank. "I don't understand." The words came out like a boy's. Innocent sighed deeply and sat down, as if his knees had finally betrayed him. Then he began to speak, not like a father, but like a man confessing to a crime of silence. "She was the first woman I ever loved," he said, not looking at either son. "We were young. Foolish, perhaps, but certain. The kind of love that made the world quiet. But my parents didn't care for love. They cared for tribe, for name, for bloodlines. They said I couldn't marry her. She wasn't one of us. So they gave me to another woman, one I didn't know how to love." The story spilled slowly, every word laced with regret. Months after the marriage, Adeyaha returned. Pregnant. "With you," he looked at Icum. "And I was caught between duty and heart. I told my wife, and surprisingly she didn't react with hate. She let Adeyaha stay. She said, 'Let her give birth. Let her finish her studies. I'll raise the boy.' And that's what happened. Adeyaha left after you were born. She had no choice. And his voice broke, I never spoke of it again. There was no one in that station who dared interrupt. Even the officer writing down notes had let his pen fall silent. Icum sank slowly to the bench behind him, the words circling in his head like birds without direction. It was impossible, unthinkable, yet undeniable. So many things suddenly made sense. The softness in Adeyaha's eyes when she looked at him, the way her smile lingered longer than necessary, the absence of harshness in her tone even when her hands shook with fear. He had grown up believing the woman who raised him was his mother, and in many ways she truly was. But this truth stabbed at the root of everything he had built his identity on. He had not just kidnapped a woman, he had betrayed a mother. His mother. The weight of that revelation pressed on him like wet sand. He lifted his head slowly and met Ken's eyes. Ken didn't say anything, but there was a flicker of something there. Understanding, maybe shame. The room remained quiet, but Adeyaha's presence behind the door shifted something in the air. She hadn't entered the station yet. She stood just beyond the threshold, listening. Her heart felt like it was being pulled apart, one half broken by the betrayal, the other reaching still for the son she had come to reclaim. When she finally stepped into the room, everyone turned. She didn't wear sorrow like a shroud. She wore it like a crown. She walked with the grace of someone who had survived things the world would never understand. Her eyes swept across the room and landed on Icum. "You are my child," she said softly, "and you were stolen from me by fear and culture and silence. But I never stopped loving you. Not once." Icum's mouth opened, but no words came. He only bowed his head and wept. No one dared speak for several minutes after that. Even the officer in charge motioned for everyone to leave the room. The remaining few, Innocent, Adeyaha, Icum, and Ken, sat in a silence that was not empty but brimming. Ken spoke first, his voice dry. "So what happens now?" Adeyaha looked at him, and for the first time, there was no hatred in her eyes. "Now we begin again," she said. "If forgiveness lives in me, then it must walk with me too." Innocent cleared his throat, the emotion caught behind his voice like a fish in a net. "They are still my sons," he said, "and you are still the woman I failed." Adeyaha didn't respond to that. She didn't need to. Her silence was not absence, it was acceptance. Icum reached out, slowly, unsure, like a boy reaching for light through a crack in a wall. His hand brushed hers. She didn't pull away. The officers returned, and after several conversations, Adeyaha declined to press charges. Her explanation was simple. "What they did was unforgivable. But I forgive them." The law didn't argue. The boys were released days later, but their freedom came with new chains, guilt, reconciliation, and the burden of rebuilding what had been so carelessly shattered. When they returned to the village, the air had shifted. The whispers had begun. The story spread not as gossip, but as awe. And through it all, the family tried to breathe again. Not perfectly, not easily, but with effort. And in that effort, they found the first trace of something new, peace, shaped not by perfection, but by truth. The first few days after their return to the village were not marked by grand gestures or bold declarations. No ceremony welcomed them. No crowd waited at the compound gate with open arms. Instead, they walked into a stillness that made every footstep sound louder than it should. People turned when they passed, some out of curiosity, others out of discomfort, but none dared speak their thoughts aloud. The boys moved with heads lowered and hands often clenched in their pockets, as if trying to hide the guilt that walked with them like a second shadow. Innocent tried to act normal, sweeping the compound before dawn and sitting beneath the mango tree like he used to, but there was a hesitation in every movement. Sometimes he would start a sentence, only to abandon it halfway, unsure if the words still fit in this version of life. Adeha stayed in her room more than usual, not in avoidance but reflection. She no longer felt like a guest, but neither did she feel entirely like she belonged. The house was filled with history now, hers, theirs, and everything in between. She would spend long hours staring out the window at the almond tree in the corner of the compound, her mind weaving old memories with new realities, trying to stitch together something whole. Ezen, who had returned briefly to tie up business loose ends in Portavira, left behind a silence of her own. She had embraced her mother when she was found, cried in her arms, and then said little afterward. Some feelings sit too heavy for quick conversations. The house was no longer just a shelter. It had become a place where truths slept and woke alongside everyone inside it. Ken was the first to speak to her properly. Not just a passing greeting or a nod of acknowledgement, but an actual conversation beneath the moonlight one night when the compound was quiet and the air smelled faintly of roasted corn from a neighbor's yard. He sat beside her, knees tapping together nervously, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt like a boy about to confess something. Adeha did not look at him at first. She kept her eyes on the distant hill beyond the village, where the trees stood still and proud, unaware of human failings. "I used to think I hated you," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Back when I first saw you here, in that room, I felt something twist in me." She finally looked at him, her gaze soft but unreadable. He continued, "I didn't know why I hated you. I just did. Maybe it was because you were in her room. My mother. The only one I knew. Maybe it was because you looked too calm, like you belonged." Adeha didn't interrupt. She let him speak. "But that day when you said my name, when you recognized me without seeing my face, something broke in me. I wasn't supposed to be seen. Not like that. Not by you." His words stumbled, unsure of their landing. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," he said, "because I don't even know if I forgive myself." Adeha reached over and placed her hand gently on his. "You were lost," she said, "but even lost people can find their way back if they stop running." That night, Ken slept better than he had in months. It wasn't peace he found, it was the beginning of understanding, and sometimes that was more important. Ikam's path to reckoning was slower and harder. He didn't approach her for days. He carried himself with a strange mix of regret and resistance, like a man unsure whether to beg for mercy or punish himself forever. He helped around the compound, kept his tone respectful, and avoided eye contact. But every now and then, she'd catch him staring when he thought she wasn't looking. On one particular evening, after the rain had come and gone in a single furious sweep, leaving the air heavy and sweet with wet earth, Adeha found him in the kitchen peeling yams. She watched for a moment, then walked in and picked up a knife. They worked in silence, their movements synchronized like an old rhythm that had always existed, waiting to be rediscovered. After a while he spoke. "I knew you looked familiar," he said. "I just didn't know how or why." She didn't reply. He kept peeling. "When I was a child, there was a woman who used to come during festivals. She would stand at the edge of the crowd and just watch. I remember wondering why she never danced." Adeha placed a peeled yam into the pot. "That was me," she said. Ikam nodded. "I didn't realize then, but I remember your eyes. They've always been the same." The knife paused in her hand. "I thought you hated me," she said quietly. "I didn't hate you," he replied. "I envied you. You had something I couldn't name, and that scared me." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You're still my son," she said. "Even after all this." His hand stopped moving. "Do I deserve that title?" She stepped closer, wiped his cheek with the back of her hand where a tear had slipped. "No one deserves love. It is given, and I gave it to you the day I held you in my arms." Weeks passed, and the rhythm of life slowly returned. The village began to soften, its initial suspicion now turning into cautious acceptance. People began greeting Adeha again at the stream, offering her yams and cola with shy smiles and questions about her health. Children laughed louder in the evenings. The air no longer felt tight. At home, small things began to shift. Ken started helping at the farm more regularly. Ikam took up carpentry from an old man down the road, finding in the weight of wood something grounding. Innocent's laughter, once lost beneath years of regret, now returned in brief moments, during meals, when watching the goats misbehave, or when Ezen sent voice notes filled with teasing. But it wasn't a perfect ending. There were nights when silence returned like a ghost. Moments when guilt came creeping back. But they were learning. All of them. Learning that family isn't always born. It's also broken, rebuilt, and carried. One evening, Adeaha sat beneath the mango tree with Ikem on one side and Ken on the other. The sky stretched above them in hues of orange and purple, birds flying home with no map but instinct. If I had told the truth sooner, she began, maybe things would be different. Ikem shook his head. We weren't ready then, Ken added, and maybe we needed to break to understand what was whole. She smiled, blinking slowly. Then let's not waste this second chance. The tree above them rustled gently as the wind passed through its leaves, like the past giving way to the present, and the present making room for something hopeful. Life has a way of hiding answers in silence and teaching us through pain. What we bury will find its way to the surface, one way or another. So speak the truth while there's still time. Love the people who are trying, even if they stumble. And never let pride be the reason you miss out on peace. Remember, healing doesn't erase the past. It simply gives the future a chance to begin again. May your days be filled with truth that sets you free, and not secrets that weigh you down. May your heart find peace where there was once pain, and may the love you give return to you in unexpected ways. May every broken part of your story be rewritten with grace. And may your family be whole, not perfect, but whole in understanding, forgiveness, and unity. As you rise each day, may you rise stronger, wiser, and wrapped in mercy. If you believe this for yourself and your household, say a loud amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.